Hello everyone and welcome to today's topic on UseReducer hook at Intellipaat. Do you know friends that UseReducer hook is a popular JavaScript library for building user interfaces? The UseReducer hook in React is used to manage complex state logic in React applications. It is an alternative to the useState hook and provides a way to update the state based on the previous state and an action. The useReducer hook takes a reducer function and initial state and returns the current state and a dispatch function. The reducer function specifies how the state should be updated based on the given action. When the dispatch function is called with an action, React re-renders the component with an updated state. Now before we move on and learn more about useReducer hook, I request you guys that do not forget to hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon. So let's discuss our agenda first. So first we are going to have an introduction where we will discuss a brief overview of React and state management. Moving ahead, we will discuss about understanding the useReducer hook, where we will have an explanation of the useReducer hook and its purpose. Then we will compare useState hook with useReducer hook and its limitation. Then we will be highlighting the benefits of useReducer for complex state management. Moving ahead, we will discuss about working with reducers, where we will have an introduction to the reducers and its role in the state updates. Then we will be demonstrating how to create a useReducer function. Moving ahead, we will also discuss the structure of an action and its relationship with the reducer. Then we will have an implementation and syntax where we will explore the syntax and the usage of useReducer hook, where we will have a walkthrough of setting up state and dispatch in a React component. And we will be also demonstrating how to handle state updates with the dispatch function. And finally, we are going to conclude our session with a discussion of advanced techniques, where we will discuss strategies for managing complex state logic, exploring the possibility of using useReducers in a single component, and finally, we will be showcasing examples of using context and use context in conjunction with useReducer. So guys, let's start our session with useReducer hook. So in this session, I will be using VS Code for our text editor. So let us create our React app first. So the syntax for creating our React app is npx create React app, then you give the name of your application. Here I have given a default value of my app. So I'm going to right click on this and it's going to create our React app. So guys, as you can see, we have downloaded our React library all over here, and we can see in our folder, which is my app. So you can see all the node modules, all inside the node modules. This is the node modules which is required to run our application. This is the public folder in which we can put our all assets all over here. Then we have src folder in which we have app.css, app.js. Then we have a testing folder, we have index.cs and index.js. Now in this I've created a folder called useReducer demo.js. So because we have to study a bit about useReducer hook, so we'll be starting it. Now in order to run our application, what I'm going to do, I'm going to navigate to my app. Then I'm going to start npm start and it will run our application on a local host 3030. So that's the one thing. So as you can see guys, our React application is up and running. Now before we move on, let me discuss what state management in React is. So as you know guys that React is a popular JavaScript library for building the user interfaces. It allows developers to create reusable UI components and build interactive web applications. One of the key concepts in React is a component-based architecture, where UI elements are divided into self-contained and reusable components that can be composed together. If I talk about state management, then state management in React refers to how data is stored and managed within components. State represents the internal of the data component that can change over the time. It includes the information that affects the component's behavior and appearance. React provides built-in useState hook that allows functional components to have state. The useState hook returns an array of two elements, the current state value and a function to update the state. By using the useState hook, developers can add and manage state within the functional components. However, as the complexity grows, then managing state using useState alone can become very challenging. This is where more advanced state management techniques such as useReducer hook come into the play. useReducer hook provides a way to handle complex state logic by centralizing the state updates in a reducer function. By using a reducer function with the useReducer hook, we can define different actions that modify the state, thus making the code more organized and maintainable. It is particularly useful when dealing with state that involves multiple related values or when the state transitions are complex. Overall, if I had to say, the state management is a very crucial aspect of building React applications, and using tools like useReducer can help streamline and simplify management of state within the components. I hope you guys, if you have studied about useStateHook, then you would have understood my context where state management has a very crucial role to play. Now, there are two types of hooks. The first one is useState and second one is useReducer hook. So we'll be comparing our code on the both of the aspect and we'll see certain examples to understand the concept of useReducer hook. So guys, the prerequisite for this video is that you should have a bare minimum knowledge of React with the knowledge of useStateHook. Okay guys, I hope so. I have made myself clear. Now let's move on to the next part of our discussion, which is explanation of the useReducer hook and what is its purpose. So as you can see this code, this is a very simple code in which I have written import React and I'm also importing useState from React. Then I have created a counter and I'm setting useStateHook to manage the state of this counter application or the counter function with const count set count equals to useState and have initialized the count value as 0. Now there are two functions which you can see. One is going to increment the count and one is going to decrement, means decrease the count and increase the count. So it is very simple. So I have used this variable set count and I have putting set count equals to count plus 1. So guys, you can imagine something like this. So there is a counter button. So there are two sides of it. One is plus and then is minus. So if we click on the plus 1, it's going to increase the count by 1. And there is if you click the minus 1, it's going to decrease the count. In the return, I'm returning our div container with count equals to count, which is this variable, the current state of the count. Then I'm creating a button on click, which is an increment button. And then I'm creating another button, which is a decrement button. So this is how the state management of our counter button is happening. And it is managing the state when the user is clicking plus or minus. So this count variable is storing the state and the value. I hope so you would have got a brief idea that how managing state is done in this counter application. Now before I demonstrate that how useReducer hook is going to replace this code and its functionality, now I want to tell you about the purpose of using useReducer hook. The useReducer hook in React is a built-in hook that provides a way to manage state in a more structured and predictable manner. It is inspired by the concepts of reducers in Redux, which is a popular state management library. The main purpose of the useReducer hook is to handle complex state logic by centralizing the state updates in a reducer function. The useReducer hook takes two arguments. The first one is the reducer function and the initial state. The reducer function defines how the state should be updated based on the dispatched action. It takes the current state and an action object as inputs and returns the new state. By dispatching actions to the reducer function, we can specify how the state should change. The useReducer hook returns an array of two elements. The first one is the current state value and a dispatch function. The current state value represents the current state of a component and a dispatch function is used to trigger actions that update the state. When the dispatch function is called with an action, the reducer function is invoked and it returns a new state. The useReducer hook is particularly useful when dealing with complex state transitions or when the state involves multiple related values. It provides a more organized and maintainable approach to state management by separating the state logic from the component. Now we are going to compare useStateHook and useReducer hook and compare some of the limitations of useStateHook. While the useReducer hook and the useStateHook both allow to manage state in React, but they have some key differences and are suitable for different scenarios. The useStateHook is simpler and more lightweight compared to useReducer hook. It is ideal for managing simple state that involves a single value for a few independent values. The useStateHook returns the current state value and a function to update the state. However, when dealing with the complex state that requires multiple actions and transition in managing state with the useState can become cumbersome and lead to code duplication. On the other hand, the useReducer hook provides a more structured approach to the state management. It allows you to handle state updates based on dispatched functions. By centralizing the state updates in the reducer, the code becomes more organized and easier to maintain. The useReducer hook is particularly useful when the state transitions are complex or when multiple values are needed to be updated together. While the useReducer hook provides more flexibility and scalability, it does have a bit more boilerplate code compared to useState. The reducer function needs to be defined and actions need to be dispatched to update the state. This can make the code slightly more verbose, especially for simple state management scenarios. So in the conclusion, if I have to say, if you have a choice to choose between useReducer and useState, it depends upon the complexity and nature of the state you are managing. For simple independent state values, I would advise you that you should use useState always. But however, if the scenario becomes more complex, where state logic or managing multiple related values, then useReducer is a powerful tool that can enhance your code organization and maintainability. So guys, I have created one more file which states useStateDemo.js, and another file which I had created earlier was useReducerDemo.js. So in these two files, we are going to compare both of these hooks. So in order to compare both of the codes for the same functionality of counter, first let's visit to useStateDemo. So in the useState, what we are doing, as told earlier, we are importing React, we created a counter function, then we used useStateHook to maintain the values or update the state of our count value all over here. Then there are two functions involved, which is increment and decrement, and I'm putting sendCount, which is updating the value of the count variable as count +1 and count -1. Then in the return div, I'm returning the count with the two buttons with increment and decrement. So this was the overall functionality. So if you try to imagine the UI, so when you click plus or minus, so it's going to store the value by returning this count object which is present in the h1 tag. This is all the overall functionality, very simple form as you see in your calculator or any plus or minus applications where you are performing the arithmetic operation using the add operator or the subtract operator. Now let's see the useReducer. So in the useReducer, what I am doing is, first of all, I am initializing our state, which is count is initialized to 0. Okay, the same thing which was done here with the useState as 0, where we are putting the count value equals to 0. Now I have created our reducer function which takes two values or two parameters. The first one is state and the second one is action. Now I'm performing our action now here using the switch. The switch is going to do your action depending upon it is an increment case or a decrement case. So in the case of increment, it is returning state.count +1, whereas it is updating the state of the count value by 1. And in a decrement case, it is actually decreasing the value of the count by -1. And in the default case, it is returning the current state of the count. So now we have created our counter function all over here. As you can see, here we have created our counter component with state and a dispatch function. Okay guys, so I have told you we are going to have two things, that is state and a dispatch. And here I am using useReducer, where it is taking the value as reducer and the initial state which we have initialized all over here. So as you can see, the count equals to 0, so it's taking the initial state. So in order to use the useReducer hook, instead of like as we used in useState, where it was count and setCount, there were two values. So here I'm going to use the two values as state, which is taking the state of the count value, and a dispatch function. Okay guys, now we will move on, and now we have created our increment. So here dispatch is type increment. So in the decrement, the dispatch function is returning the type as decrement. Okay guys, I hope so it's clear to you. Now this is basically the same function which we have created in the case of increment or decrement, which the reducer function is returning. So I've created the functions for the same. So it is going to return it with the use of dispatch function, which is be taken by the reducer, which we have created all over here. Okay guys, I hope so it's clear. Now I'm returning an h1 tag with our count, and this is going to return the current state of our count value. Then by clicking the button of the increment, it's going to increment the value, and on clicking decrement, it's going to decrement the value. So this is how useReducer for a simple counter application is differing from useState. Now guys, you'd be wondering that the code of the useReducer is pretty much long, but both of them are performing the same task. As I've told you earlier, the complexity is going to increase when you have to handle or manage or update different component states value at one time. So writing use state for each of the component will be very tough for you. So that's why in that case we use UseReducer. Now we'll move on and understand the next part of it. So now we will discuss an example that is going to demonstrate that how the useReducer hook allows for complex state transition that would be pretty challenging to handle with the useState hook. Now let us consider a scenario where we have a form with multiple input fields and where we want to enable or disable a submit button based on the validity of the form inputs. We will assume that the form is valid only if all the fields have non-empty value. Using the useState, the logic to handle the state transition and validity checks would become cumbersome. Each input field would need its own state variable and we would have to update all the state variables whenever an input value changes. Additionally, we would need to manually track the validity of each input field and update the submit button's disabled state accordingly. So here is one with the use state, we are achieving the same, and here with the useReducer, so you can see how the difference is there. So now if you go to the use state, this is the form field. So guys, here is a form which I have created, and in this I have used for name, email and checking whether the form is valid or not. Okay, so here we have initialized as empty, and here so I have taken is form valid variable to false initially. Now here I am changing the handle change function where I am setting the name of the variable using the set name as target.value. Okay, we are targeting the value and checking if the name is valid or not by using set is form valid when name is not equals to empty and email is not equals to empty. Similarly, same for the handle change. I have done the same thing where I'm setting the email to a target email value which we have entered in our application. Okay, this is a real-time value when a user is trying to type its email. Then I am checking out whether this form is valid or not by checking name is not equals to empty and email is not equals to empty. Now there is a handle submit button, and here I am putting e.prevent.default. Now overall I am returning our form on submit as handle submit. This is actually submitting our form, and the input type for name is text, then value will be the name, this where we have declared here in our hook the name value, and it's returning the name object all over here. So here we have on change where it is actually setting the name of our variable which is name. Then similarly for value for email, okay, so here we have button type submit and which is exactly disabled if the form is invalid. If you click on the submit button, the only way it's going to submit the form when your form is actually valid. So the form will get disabled if the form is invalid. This is a basic form functionality. Suppose you are going for your registration form where you have to set your name, email. So here we are validating our form whether our form is valid or not. I hope so you would have got a brief idea what this code is doing. Now let us see to the useReducer. So in the useReducer, what we are trying to do, so first we are initializing our state. So here as you can see, name is empty, email is empty, and our form valid is false. Okay, the first thing in the useReducer hook, if you are using it, then you have to initialize the state of your value. Then the next thing is you have to create your reducer function. Okay, where you have to discuss what will be the action type. Okay, so here is a reducer function, and reducer function takes two parameters. The first is state and the second is action. Now here we are going to perform our switch operation. So action.type, in this case we are updating our name. So here we are returning the state, what is the current state, where the email, name and whether the form is valid or not. And this is the spread operator. So it's returning all the values with the state is considering. Okay, so what is the name of, so here is a case of update name. So it's returning the state of the name. Okay, then the action is payload. Okay, and is form is valid or not. We have to check if the action.payload is not equals to empty and state.email is not equals to empty, which we have performed all over here as you can see guys, which is handle name change. So instead of handle name change, we are doing this in our reducer function only. Okay, you can see how it has become just so pretty easy if we are just creating just one function to handle all these things. But instead we have created two functions basically, which is handle name change and handle email change. But in the useReducer, what we are doing basically, we are just creating one reducer function which is handling all the state changes. So if the case of update name comes up, so we are returning the state where name is action.payload and is form is valid or not. If action.payload, where the user types basically, this code denotes the same, is empty or not. If it is not empty and the mail is also not empty, you're going to return the update name. Similarly goes for update email. Okay guys, you can see the code all over here. And the default, we are returning our state. Now let us create our form component. So inside our form function guys, what we will be using is the useReducer function. Okay, so in which we have the state and a dispatch function. So in the useReducer, it's going to take first parameter as a reducer, which we have created all over here, this reducer function. And then we're going to take the initial state. Okay guys, now here we are creating the first function for the name change all over here. So constant handle name change. Here we have type given, update name and payload to e.target.value. Similarly for handle email change, I'm taking the values from the user directly by e. So here e is the event basically. So event happens when the user types something. So the dispatch functions is returning the update name payload and the update email payload. Okay, then the handle submit, which is basically returning that the form submission logic is there, that e.prevent.default. Similarly, this form is basically returning this form component, that form.onSubmit should be the handle submit. Okay, if everything satisfies, if your name goes on right and if your email goes on right, then your form is going to get submitted. So input type for email is email, as you can see, and button type is there for submit, which is disabled if the state of the form is invalid. So here we have given a logic how your form is invalid if you have your name as empty and your email as empty. This is a pretty basic code in which we have created a form and basically validating whether the form is valid or not. So there were certain use state hooks which we have taken for name and email. So by using the useReducer hook, we are actually decreasing our task. Now, if we are given more fields, then you would see the complexity for the use state is going to increase. But here useReducer is actually will be very useful for this case of complex functionality. I hope so guys, you would have got a brief idea regarding this. Now let's move on and discuss our next topic. Now guys, we will discuss the roles of reducer. Reducers actually play a very crucial role in state updates and are a fundamental concept in many state management libraries, including Redux. A reducer is a pure function that takes current state and an action as an input and returns a new state. The primary purpose of a reducer is to define how the state should be updated in response to the dispatched action. It serves as a central hub for managing state transition, making the state management process more predictable and maintainable. When an action is dispatched, it carries information about the type of an action and any additional payload that is required for the state update. The reducer receives this action and determines how the state should change based on its type. Inside a reducer function, a switch statement or if-else conditions are typically used to handle different action types. Each case represents a specific action type and defines how state should be updated accordingly. The reducer returns a new state object based on the action type and the current state. Reducers are designed to be pure functions, meaning they do not modify the original state directly but instead produce a new state object. This immutability ensures that the state remains predictable and helps with debugging and time travel debugging. By separating the state updates into a dedicated reducer function, complex state transition can be managed more effectively. But I have told you earlier regarding the same. If the fields in the form have increased, then using use state can be a little bit cumbersome. But by using a reducer function, it could really help us a lot. So reducers promote a unidirectional data flow where actions triggers the state updates through reducers, thus making the code more maintainable and easier to reason about. So reducers are commonly used in conjunction with hooks like useReducer in React or libraries like Redux. They provide a structured approach to state management by centralizing the state updates and decoupling them from components themselves. In summary, if I have to say, reducers play a crucial role in state updates by defining how the state should change in response to dispatched actions. They provide a predictable and structured way to manage state transitions and promoting maintainable code, thus facilitating unidirectional data flow in state management. Now guys, I'm going to demonstrate how you're going to create a reducer function. So guys, this is the code demonstrating how we are using useReducer hook and basically creating the reducer function. So here in this example, we have initialized our state object called initial state representing the initial state properties. The reducer function reducer takes the current state and an object as parameters. Inside the reducer function, we could see a switch statement which is used to handle different action type. Each case corresponds to a specific action type and defines how the state should be updated accordingly. In this example, we have three different cases: the increment, decrement, and set loading. The reducer returns a new state object based on the action type and the current state. To use the reducer, we invoke it with the initial state and an action object. Okay, so here we are invoking our reducer with initial state and type of the action. Okay guys, it's pretty clear. So we are printing our required state. In this example, the uses section, we demonstrate how the reducer function is called with different actions to update the state. The console log statements show the resulting state after each state update. So this example basically provides a demonstration of creating a reducer function. In real-world applications, reducers can handle more complex state updates and can involve additional properties and actions specific to your application's need. I hope so guys, it's clear to you that how we are creating basically our reducer function. So here we have demonstrated you that how to create a reducer function with taking state and type of the action. So whenever we are invoking our reducer function, it is taking two parameters. The first is the initial state or the state, and second the type of the action. Okay guys, which is present all over here. So this is the next thing. I hope so it's clear to you guys. Now let's move on and discuss about the structure of an action and its relationship with the reducer. So guys, the structure of an action and its relationship with the reducer is an essential aspect of state management in Redux and similar state management libraries. Let's dive into the structure of action and how it relates to the reducer. The first one we have guys is the action structure. Okay guys, the first one which we have used here, so I'll type it, that is action structure. So let us discuss about the action structure. So guys, an action is a plain JavaScript object that represents an intention to change the state. It has a required type property that describes the type of an action being performed. The type should be a descriptive string that gives a clear indication of the action being dispatched. Additional optional properties can be included in the action object to provide any necessary data or payload for the state update. Here is an example of the action structure. So here is constant action, where we have given our type as increment and payload has given 5, which is kind of an optional payload. Now, in the example above, the action has a type increment, which is indicating that it intends to increment the state value. It also includes an optional payload property with a value 5, which can also be used by reducer to perform the state update. Now, if I discuss the relationship with the reducer, the relationship between actions and the reducer is based on the principles of unidirectional data flow. Actions are dispatched by the components or the other parts of the application to notify the reducer about the desired state change. The reducer in turn receives these actions and determines how the state should be updated based on the given action type. The reducer is pure function that takes current state and an action as arguments and returns a new state object. Inside the reducer, a switch statement or if-else statement conditions are typically used to handle different state or action type, and each case in the switch statement corresponds to a specific action type and defines how the state should be updated. So the relationship can be summarized something like this. Actions are dispatched by the components or other parts of the application. The reducer receives the dispatched action. The reducer examines the type of the action and performs the state update accordingly. The reducer returns a new state object. So here is an example how a reducer handles different action types. Okay, so we have initialized our initial state with count equals to 0. This is our reducer function, which is taking state equals to initial state and declared another parameter as action. Now there's a switch case of action.type where the first case is of increment and it is returning the state, the count, and the action payload. Similarly for decrement, and at the end it is returning the default state. So this is how a reducer handles different action types. I hope so guys, you would have got an idea regarding the same. So let me elaborate this one more time so that it would get clear to you. So in the summary, if I have to say again, then by dispatching the actions with specific types and payloads, the reducer can respond to those actions and update the state accordingly, thus maintaining a very predictable and centralized state management approach. So basically, actions are plain JavaScript objects that represents the intention to change the state. They have a type property indicating the action type and can include additional payload data. The reducer receives these actions and performs a state update based on the action type, thus returning a new state object. This relationship between actions and the reducer performs the basis of unidirectional data flow in state management libraries like Redux. So now we will be exploring the syntax and usage of useReducer hook. The useReducer hook in React is basically used for managing state using the concept of reducers, which I have told you earlier. So its syntax would be something like this. So as you can see, we are using our useReducer hook, which is taking the parameter a reducer and the initial state. And here we are declaring a variable with state and a dispatch function. So as you can see, what are the parameters present all over here? The first one is a reducer, which is a required one. So a reducer function will specify how the state should be updated based on the dispatched action. It takes the current state and an action as an input and returns a new state. Then there is an initial state, as you can see guys, which is kind of an optional. So the initial state is actually representing the initial state of your application. Now we are going to discuss what are the return values we are getting. So we are getting a return value, a state, and a dispatch function. The state is a current state value which is managed by the reducer, and the dispatch function is basically used to dispatch actions to update the state. It accepts an action object as its parameter. Now let's discuss its uses. Now first we are importing React and useReducer hook from React. Then we are creating a reducer function which is taking a state and an action. Here it is going to handle different action type and it will return the updated state. Then here we are creating our initial state where we are going to specify our initial state properties. Now we are going to use the useReducer hook in our component. So inside the component we are creating constant state and a dispatch function. So a dispatch function will be present all over here in the reducer. So useReducer is going to specify the reducer and the initial state. So here we are going to access the state values. So as we have done it earlier. So as I have shown you how we have used to access the state values using the state property, you could see or go back to the video and see the code. Similarly, we have used dispatch actions to update the state where dispatch type action type and we are giving the payload. Now finally, we are returning our JSX syntax. So this is how the overall boilerplate for our useReducer hook is there. First of all, we are importing useReducer, then we are creating a reducer function to handle the different action types. Then we are declaring the initial state. Then we are using the useReducer hook in our component, such by creating my component, which is the pseudo name I have given. Here I am declaring two variables, which is state and a dispatch, and using the useReducer hook, which is taking two parameters, the reducer and the initial state. First of all, what you have to do inside this component, you have to access the state values. Then you have to dispatch actions to update the state, as we have done in the previous codes. Now finally, we will return our JSX elements. I hope so guys, you would have got an idea regarding the syntax of the useReducer hook. Now guys, we will discuss the strategies for managing complex state logic. Managing complex state logic in a React application can be very challenging, but there are several strategies that can help make it more manageable and maintainable. The first one is using useReducer composition. Break down complex state into smaller, more manageable pieces by using multiple reducers. Each reducer can handle a specific part of the state, thus making it easier to reason about and maintain it. You can combine these reducers using techniques like combined reducers from Redux. Then second of all is normalize state shape. Normalize your state structure by organizing related data into separate entities. This can improve performance, simplify updates, and make it easier to manage complex relationships between different entities in your application. The third one is using useSelector function. The selector functions can provide a clean and consistent interface for accessing complex state data. They can encapsulate complex logic and calculation, thus making it easier to consume state values in your components. The fourth one is using middleware. Middleware can intercept and augment actions before they reach the reducers, thus allowing you to implement additional logic or side effects. This can be useful for handling asynchronous operations, logging, or handling complex workflows. Fifth one is consider libraries and patterns. You have to utilize external libraries like Redux or MobX that provides advanced state management capabilities. These libraries offer tools and patterns for managing complex state logic, including actions, reducers, and middleware. The next can be you can plan and document state changes. When dealing with complex state, it's essential to plan and document how state changes will occur. By defining a clear set of actions and their expected outcomes, you can ensure consistency and predictability in your state changes. The next one is you have to leverage immutability. Immutable data can help ensure predictable state updates and prevent unwanted side effects. Use libraries like Immutable.js or Immer to enforce immutability and simplify working with immutable data structures. Then you can follow the best practices. Follow the established best practices for state management, single source of truth, separation of concerns, and avoiding mutable state. These practices can lead to cleaner and more maintainable code. By employing these strategies, you can effectively manage complex state logic in your React application, thus leading to a better organization, maintainability, and scalability. Now let us explore the possibility of using multiple useReducers in a single component. So here, as you can see in this code, we have initialized our initial state as 0 and we are using count variable for the same. And there is another initial state which is initial state 2. Here I have written text as empty. Now we have created our first reducer function which is taking state and action parameters, and I have used switch statement all over here. So action.type is a required argument inside this. So the first case is of increment and it is returning the state, the count, by state.count plus 1. Then there is a decrement where we are returning the state with a count of state.count minus 1, and in the default we are just returning the current state. Similarly, we have created another reducer 2 which is taking the same parameter, a state and an action. Here I have used the switch statement. Inside this we have the action.type and I have the switch statement which is taking action.type argument, in which the case is setText. So I am returning the state, the text, which is action.payload, and in default I am returning the state. Now we have created one function which is multiple reducer component, so this is our component basically, and inside this we have used our useReducer hook. So first one is taking the state 1 with dispatch 1 and second is taking the state 2 with dispatch 2. So I've used useReducer, reducer 1 and initialized our state 1, and here I have initialized our state 2. Then I'm handling the increment with the dispatch 1 type increment, handle the decrement with type decrement. This is coming under dispatch 1 which is under this. Okay. Now the second one is of handle text and in which I'm taking as dispatch 2. This is our second action type, and here I am typing that set text which I have used all over here in this case. Okay guys, I hope so it's clear to you, and it is finally returning our payload which is e.target.value, which is the required value which is given by the user. Then we are returning our count with state1.count, and here I have created the two buttons which is of increment and a decrement. And second one is of text state, and here I am returning the state of the text which is basically the JavaScript object returned by the h2 tag. Then I have given the input type as text and value is state2.text, the value of the state, and on change it is basically handling the set text. So as you can see guys, in this case we have used the multiple reducers. We have created reducer 1 and reducer 2. I hope so you would have got an idea that how to create multiple useReducers in a single component. Now guys, let's move to a final part of our discussion, that is showcasing examples of using context and use context in conjunction with useReducer. Now before that, let us discuss what is use context. So use context is basically a React hook that allows you to access the value of the context directly within a functional component. Context provides a way to share data between components without having to pass props through each level of the component tree manually. With use context, you can consume the current value of a context by providing the context object, creating using the create context as an argument. It returns the current value of the context. So your syntax could be something like this. So guys, here is the syntax for using the use context. First, we have created our context value, and I'm using the useContext hook, and in which I'm putting my context. So here is an example of showcasing the use of useContext. So here, my context represents the context object that was created using the create context. The useContext hook returns the current value of my context. It's important to note that useContext can only be used within functional components, not within regular JavaScript function or class components. By using useContext, you can access the context value in any part of your component, thus allowing you to consume and utilize the shared data without having to pass it through each intermediate component in the component tree. So here is a sample example for the same. So in this example, we create a context object called myContext using create context. We define a component, myComponent, that consumes the value of myContext using the useContext. And finally, we wrap myComponent within myContext.provider in the app component, thus providing the value of hello context to be consumed by myComponent. So when myComponent is rendered within the myContext.provider, it will have access to the context value of hello context, which can be displayed in the rendered output. This allows you to pass data functions or any other values through the context and thus consume them within any component that needs to access that shared value without the need for prop drilling. I hope so guys, you would have got an idea regarding the same. So as you can see the code, it's pretty easy. Here first we are creating the create context. Then we are defining a component that consumes the context. Okay. So here context value equals to use context and our value is my context. And I'm basically returning the context value, which is this context value. Then I'm using the context provider to share the value. So my context.provider value equals to hello context. And this is basically rendered inside the my component. So inside this return function, as you can see, we have my context.provider, which is basically returning the value of hello context and my component. I hope so guys, you would have got a brief idea regarding useContext. Now let us see the next example. So now we will be showcasing an example of using context and useContext in conjunction with useReducer. So as you can see guys, all over here, we have imported our React. Then we are importing form provider and useFormContext from .formContext. Here we are creating our form component, and here state and dispatch are given as an argument, and it is using form context. Then we are creating handle submit, which is taking an action E, and it is performing the submit action. Then we are creating another function for handling. Basically this is reset, where type is reset. Now we are returning our div container. Inside this we have an h2 tag of the contact form, and form on submit is going to submit our form. Then inside this div container we have a label for name, okay, and there the input is type of text, id is name, value is state.name, and on change e.dispatch type will be setting the name and payload will be e.target.value. Then similarly for email, as we can see, the input type will be of email, id email, value will be the state.email, and on change we are dispatching the type set email and payload the target value. Similarly for message, we are doing the same, id message, value state.message, on change e, and dispatch is set to set message. Now we are creating two buttons. The first one is type of submit and we are submitting it. The second type is of button, and on clicking this, it is going to reset the value. Now we are creating our app, and inside the form provider, we are putting our form component. I hope so guys, you would have got an idea regarding the same. Now guys, we have created our form component, but still something is missing. Where is this form provider? So I've created this file all over here, from where we are importing all these things. So this is basically our form provider. So here we are importing create context, use context, and useReducer from React. Now let us create our form context using create context function. Now inside the form provider, we are passing our argument children as constant initial state with name as empty, email as empty string, and message as an empty string. Now the form reducer function, as the same we have studied earlier, is taking two arguments, the state and the type of the action. Here the switch is of type action.type, where we are setting the name. Similarly, here we are returning the email or setting our email. Here we are setting the message, and final action is of reset. Now at the default, we are returning our state. Here we are using the useReducer hook. So constant state and dispatch function is used, and we are using useReducer And here we are taking the first parameter as form reducer and the second one as initial state. Now in the return function, what we are basically doing is we are calling form context.provider with the value equals to state and dispatch. And here I am passing the children, which is basically these values. Okay guys, I hope so you would have got an idea. And this is our form context. Okay, so inside this form context.provider, whose value is equals to state, and the type of the action is dispatch. And in between them, we are rendering our children object, which is taking care of the value of name, email, and message. Now, here we are creating the use form context with using the function arrow function, and here use context is equals to form context. Inside these parentheses, we have passed our parameter form context. And here I am exporting our form provider and use form context. So I hope so guys, you would have got an idea regarding the form provider. So what in this file are present? So in this file, what is present is basically your form provider, okay, and your form context. So basically, I'm using useReducer hook in conjunction with create context and use context to pass the data. So I'll repeat once again. So in the form.provider.js, we have our form context. We are creating this context using this create context. Then we have created our form provider, which will carry these values of name, email, and message. We create our reducer function to handle the state. Okay, so here we are using the useReducer hook, which is taking the state and a dispatch with the form reducer and initial state as an argument. Now we are returning our values with the form context.provider. Okay, inside this we are passing this children, which is basically name, email, and message. And finally, we have created our use form context, and inside this we are using the use context hook, and we are taking this form context. Okay guys, I hope so you have got the idea that this is our form context, and finally we are exporting our form provider and use form context. Now inside this form component, so we have created our form component, which is taking state and dispatch, and it is using use form context. Now in order to handle the submit, I have created this function. In order to handle the reset, I have created this function. Now basically we are returning inside a div container a contact form, a form with submit, then we are creating a label for name, okay, then we are creating a label for email. Similarly, we are creating a label for message. So on change of these actions will be taken by the dispatch, whose type is set to name and payload is set to e.target.value. Similarly, I have created a button with a type submit button, and similarly there is another button which is going to reset it. So inside our form provider, I have passed our form component. And finally, I am exporting our app to the index.js file. So I hope so guys, you would have got a brief idea regarding how to use create context and use context in conjunction with useReducer. So this was one of the good example showcasing the use of create context, use context, and useReducer. That was all for today's session guys. I hope so you would have enjoyed our today's video on useReducer hook.
Just a quick info guys, Intellipaat offers full stack web developer course in collaboration with E&ICT Academy IIT Guwahati. Through this course, you can learn everything from front-end web development to back-end web development from esteemed IIT Guwahati faculties and industry experts. With this course, we have already helped thousands of professionals in successful career transition. You can check out their testimonials on our Achievers channel, whose link is given in the description below. Without a doubt, this course can set your career to new heights. So visit the course page link given below in the description and take a first step towards career growth in the field of web development.